The crystal pitcher in Mary's hand felt like a mountain. For 2 years, she had been a ghost, a shadow in a black uniform, refilling water glasses for men who didn't know her name. But tonight, the man at table 7 isn't just any billionaire. James Gillen is about to sign a document that looks like a peace treaty but reads like a death warrant. As a disgraced former prosecutor, Mary sees the trap hidden in Section 7, a legal landmine designed to strip him of everything. If she stays silent, she stays safe. If she speaks, she exposes the identity she's been hiding in the shadows. But as James reaches for the pen, Mary's voice cuts through the billionaire's silence like a jagged blade. "That clause is a trap," she whispers. The world stops. A ruthless CEO looks up, and a waitress who has lost everything decides that tonight she will not let another empire fall to a lie. The Sovereign Room was a place where silence was bought and sold more often than the vintage Bordeaux. It was an establishment designed for the elite, the kind of men who negotiated the fate of cities over Wagyu steak and spoke in a shorthand of power that required no translation. For Mary Hodges, it was a sanctuary of invisibility. 2 years ago, Mary had stood in the center of a different kind of room. As the youngest lead prosecutor in the district's history, her voice had been a weapon, her mind a fortress of justice. She had been the woman who never lost a RICO case, the one who saw the patterns in the chaos of corporate crime. But that fortress had been dismantled, brick by a conspiracy of lies. Now, the hands that once held federal indictments were calloused from carrying heavy trays. And the eyes that once stared down criminals were trained to look only at the floor. Her feet throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a constant reminder of her fall from grace. 12-hour shifts on marble floors had replaced the intellectual adrenaline of the courtroom. She was exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of a woman who had been erased, who had spent 730 days pretending she didn't have a brain, capable of dismantling a billion-dollar empire. Tonight, the air in the Sovereign Room felt heavy, charged with a familiar, toxic electricity. It was the same atmosphere she remembered from the moments before a massive legal raid, a stillness that preceded a storm. At the center of it was James Gillen. James didn't look like a man who needed protection. He sat at the head of the private table, his presence commanding the very oxygen in the room. He was a Wall Street legend, a tech titan who had built a kingdom on logic and iron will. His face was a mask of cold, calculated precision, framed by dark hair and a suit that cost more than Mary's annual salary. He was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a high-performance machine that didn't understand the concept of failure. Across from him sat Anthony Marks, a man who wore success like a costume that didn't quite fit. Anthony was smiling too much, talking too fast. To the untrained eye, he looked like a partner offering a hand in friendship. To Mary, he looked like a predator closing a cage. Between them lay a contract. 47 pages of legal architecture, embossed in leather. As Mary approached to refill the water glasses, her gaze instinctively drifted to the open pages. It was a reflex she couldn't kill, a ghost of the woman she used to be. She saw the standard arbitration clauses, the revenue splits, the boilerplate language of a merger. And then her heart stopped. Subsection C of Section 7. It was buried under 3 layers of cross-references and passive voice terminology. To any other reader, it looked like a standard asset preservation clause. To Mary, it was a honey-pot trap. It was the exact same legal mechanism her former mentor, Raymond Voss, had used to seize assets in cases where the evidence was thin. If James Gillen signed this, he wasn't just entering a partnership. He was voluntarily handing over the keys to his kingdom to a corrupt federal task force waiting in the wings. The trauma of her own downfall flared in her chest like a fresh wound. She remembered the day the ethics complaints appeared, the fabricated evidence, the way her colleagues turned their backs, the cold gavel of the disbarment hearing. They had used the law to destroy her because she wouldn't help them lie. Now she was watching them do it again. Her hand trembled as she reached for James's glass. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a sense of raw, suppressed power. He was so close she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and expensive ink. She should walk away. If she spoke, Anthony Marks would report her. She would lose this job, her only lifeline. She might even be targeted again. The invisibility was her only protection. But as James Gillen unsheathed a silver fountain pen, The injustice of it became unbearable. She saw her own reflection in the polished wood of the table, a tired, hollowed-out version of the woman who used to believe in the truth. "Don't," she whispered. The word was so soft it was almost lost to the hum of the air conditioning. James didn't look up, but his hand paused a fraction of an inch above the signature line. Anthony Marks frowned, his eyes darting to Mary. "Excuse me?" Mary's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm. She felt the weight of her 2 years of silence breaking. She felt the ghosts of every person she had failed to protect when she was a prosecutor. Section 7. Subsection C, Mary said, her voice growing stronger, colder, reclaiming the authority she had buried in the dirt. "It's not an arbitration clause. It's a voluntary forfeiture agreement under 18 U.S.C. 1963. If you sign that, Mr. Gillen, you aren't merging your company. You're surrendering it to the Eastern District's Asset Seizure Fund." The silence that followed was absolute. Anthony Marks went pale, his mask of friendship dissolving into a sneer of pure, unfiltered venom. James Gillen slowly lowered the pen. He turned his head, his dark, piercing eyes finally meeting Mary's. For the first time in 2 years, someone truly saw her. He didn't look at her as a waitress. He looked at her as an equal. He looked at her as a threat. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply leaned back, his gaze raking over her tired face, her cheap uniform, and the brilliant, defiant fire in her eyes. "Who are you?" James asked. His voice was a low, melodic growl that vibrated in Mary's marrow. "I'm the person who just saved your life," Mary replied, her legs shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the table. "And I think you should ask Mr. Marks why he's working for the people who want to destroy you." Anthony stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "James, this is absurd. This servant is mentally ill. Security, get her out of here." But James didn't move. He kept his eyes on Mary, a flicker of something intrigue, perhaps, or a rare spark of respect crossing his features. He reached out and slid the contract toward Mary. "Explain it," he commanded. "You have 60 seconds before I decide whether to fire my legal team or hand you over to the police for interfering with a multi-billion-dollar negotiation." Mary took a deep breath. The exhaustion was still there, the Jorgenluck was heavy, but for the first time since her career ended, she felt alive. She pulled the document toward her, her fingers dancing over the pages she had been born to read. "You don't have 60 seconds. Mr. Gillen," Mary said, her eyes locking onto his with the intensity of a master strategist. "You have a war to win. And I'm the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." The ride in the back of James Gillen's obsidian black sedan was silent, but the air was thick with the unsaid. Mary sat as far from him as the leather seat allowed, her hands folded primly in her lap to hide their trembling. She was still wearing her stained waitress uniform, a stark contrast to the quiet opulence surrounding her. Outside, the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and neon. But Mary only saw the ghostly reflection of the woman she used to be. James didn't look at her. He stared out the window, his jaw set in a hard line. He was a man used to being the smartest person in any room. Yet a woman who smelled like industrial floor cleaner and expensive espresso had just dismantled his entire legal strategy in 30 seconds. "You're Mary Hodges," he said finally, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. It wasn't a question. The gold standard of the Eastern District. Disbarred 2 years ago for evidence tampering in the Miller case. Mary felt a phantom stab of pain in her chest. "I didn't tamper with anything, Mr. Gillen. I found out the FBI's star witness was a paid actor. I refused to sign the indictment, so they signed my professional death warrant instead." James turned his head then. The streetlights flickered across his face, revealing a flash of something that wasn't coldness, it was recognition. "Betrayal is a bitter vintage, isn't it? I've tasted it myself. My own father was sold out by his board of directors when I was 12. I watched them take his name, his pride, and eventually his life. I spent 20 years making sure no one could ever do that to me." "And yet," Mary whispered, looking at the contract sitting between them on the armrest, "you almost let them." "I was looking for a business rival," James admitted, a rare note of vulnerability creeping into his tone. "I wasn't looking for a ghost from the Justice Department." The car pulled into the subterranean garage of a glass spire that pierced the clouds. James led her through a private elevator to a penthouse that felt more like a sanctuary than a home. It was minimalist, cold, and desperately lonely. Huge windows overlooked a city that James owned but perhaps didn't belong to. "Eat," James commanded. Gesturing to a spread of food his staff had prepared in his absence. Mary hesitated, then realized she hadn't eaten a real meal in 14 hours. As she took a bite of a simple salad, the exhaustion she had been suppressed for years finally surged to the surface. Her eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. She felt the weight of every double shift, every rude customer she had smiled at. Every night she had cried herself to sleep in a studio apartment that smelled of damp wood. James watched her, his expression softening in a way his shareholders would never recognize. He walked over and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He didn't hand her one. He set it on the table near her hand. "Your feet," he said abruptly. Mary blinked. "What?" "You've been shifting your weight every 30 seconds since we left the restaurant. You're in pain." Before she could protest, he moved. He didn't call a servant. The billionaire CEO, a man who controlled billions, knelt on the plush rug in front of her. He reached out and gently unbuckled the cheap, scuffed black work shoes she wore. "Mr. Gillen, please." "James," he corrected, his voice low and firm. He pulled off her socks, revealing the red, swollen skin and the blisters earned from years of invisible labor. His fingers were surprisingly gentle, his touch warm against her cold skin. "No one should have to disappear like you did, Mary. Not someone with a mind like yours. Not someone with a heart that still cares about justice after what they did to you." Mary looked down at the top of his head, at the precision of his haircut and the tension in his shoulders. In that moment, the billionaire icon vanished. She saw a boy who had watched his father break, a man who had built a fortress of money to keep the world at bay, only to find himself trapped inside it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You could have just taken the information and sent me on my way with a check." James looked up, his dark eyes searching hers. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I met someone who wasn't looking at my bank account or my influence. You looked at a contract and saw a crime. You looked at me and saw a man about to fall. You risked the only safety you had to save a stranger." He paused, his thumb brushing against her ankle. "I don't just want your legal mind, Mary. I want to know how you stayed so sincere in a world this dark." Mary reached down, her fingers tentatively touching his shoulder. The expensive fabric of his suit felt like armor, but beneath it, she felt the steady human beat of his heart. The trauma of her past and the exhaustion of her present seemed to melt into the quiet of the room. "I stayed sincere because I had nothing else left," she whispered. "When they take your name and your career, all you have is who you are when no one is watching." James stood up slowly, not breaking eye contact. The distance between them had vanished. The air was no longer toxic. It was intimate. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered there, his palm cupping her cheek. "They won't take anything else from you," James promised. "Not while I'm standing. We're going to find out exactly who is behind this North Point Holdings. We're going to find every hand that touched that contract. And then, Mary, we're going to give you back your life." Mary felt a sob catch in her throat, not of sadness, but of relief. For 2 years, she had been a ghost. Tonight, James Gillen had called her by her name and brought her back to the land of the living. They spent the rest of the night hunched over his massive mahogany desk, the city lights shimmering behind them. James shared his private ledgers, and Mary shared her knowledge of the shadows within the Department of Justice. As they worked, their shoulders occasionally brushed, a soft contact that sent jolts of electricity through Mary's tired frame. She watched him speak, the way he paced when he was thinking, the way he took his coffee black, the way he frowned when he spoke about the corrupt officials he had encountered. He was brilliant, ruthless in his logic, but she saw the cracks now. She saw the man who stayed up late because the silence of the penthouse was too loud. "Anthony Marks isn't the architect," Mary said, pointing to a string of wire transfers. "He's too sloppy. These accounts are being routed through a server in the Caymans that the FBI used to use for off-the-books sting operations. This is Raymond Voss, my old boss." James gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "Then he's the one we break." "We can't just break him, James. He's protected by the system. We have to make him break himself." James turned to her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. But when his gaze settled on her, the predator vanished, replaced by a man looking at the woman who had become his North Star. Then let's get to work. Counselor, he murmured as the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, painting the penthouse in shades of rose and gold. Mary realized she wasn't exhausted anymore. She was a prosecutor again. And for the first time, she wasn't fighting for an abstract concept of justice. She was fighting for the man who had knelt at her feet and seen the woman behind the waitress. The air in James's private study was thick with the scent of old books, expensive espresso, and the electric hum of high-end servers. For 72 hours, Mary had barely slept. Her mind, once sluggish from the repetitive grind of the restaurant, was now firing with a rhythmic, lethal precision. She moved between 3 monitors, her fingers dancing across the keys as she wove a masterpiece of legal deception. James sat nearby, watching her. He wasn't looking at the screens anymore. He was looking at her profile, the way her brow furrowed in concentration and the way she bit her lip when she found a particularly clever way to hide a trap. He had seen brilliance before, but Mary's intelligence was different. It wasn't fueled by greed or ego. It was a quiet, righteous fire. "You've been at it for 5 hours straight, Mary," James said softly, walking over to stand behind her chair. "Rest. The world won't end if you take 20 minutes. "It might," Mary replied without looking up. "Voss is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. If this counter-contract isn't perfect, if there is even one misplaced comma, he'll see the hook. I'm writing 63 pages of what looks like total surrender. But in reality, it's a confession signed by the federal government." James placed his hands on her shoulders. Mary froze for a second, feeling the warmth of his palms through the silk of her blouse. Slowly, she leaned back into him, letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 2 years. His touch was grounded, a silent promise that she wasn't fighting this war alone. "Explain the honeypot to me again," James murmured, his breath warm against her hair. Mary pointed to the screen, her voice regaining its professional edge. "Section 12. I framed it as a transparency and oversight clause. It looks like you're giving North Point Holdings, Voss's shell company, unprecedented access to your digital infrastructure for compliance monitoring. In reality, the language I used creates a legal closed loop. The moment they log into your servers using the credentials provided in this contract, they are technically committing unauthorized access under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because the contract specifies that the access is only valid if the entity is a private commercial enterprise." James's eyes sharpened. "And since they are a federal front—" "Exactly," Mary said, a cold smile touching her lips. "By accepting the oversight role, they are documenting their own criminal conspiracy. They are masquerading as a private business to bypass the Fourth Amendment. This contract doesn't just protect your assets, James. It turns their entire operation into a federal crime. If they sign this, every piece of evidence they've gathered against you becomes fruit of the poisonous tree. It becomes inadmissible in any court in the world." James turned her chair around so she was facing him. He knelt down again, not to take off her shoes this time, but to take her hands in his. His expression was a mixture of awe and something much deeper, something that looked like devotion. "You're remarkable," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "I spent millions on the best legal firms in the country, and they all told me to settle. They all told me the trap was inescapable. And here you are, a woman the world tried to throw away, building a cage for the people who thought they were the hunters." Mary felt her heart swell. "I'm not doing this just because I'm a lawyer, James. I'm doing this because they tried to take my soul. And they almost succeeded until I met you." The tension in the room shifted. It was no longer just about contracts and corruption. James reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I lived in a fortress of glass and steel, Mary. I thought I was safe because I was powerful. But I was just lonely. Watching you these last few days, seeing your mind work, seeing your courage, it's made me realize that I don't want to go back to that fortress. Not unless you're there with me." Mary's breath hitched. "James, I'm still a disgraced waitress in the eyes of the law. I have no standing, no future." "You are the woman who saved my empire," James countered, his eyes burning with an intense sincerity. "And you are the woman I'm falling in love with." The law can be rewritten. We're going to rewrite yours. He leaned in, and for a moment the war outside vanished. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a billionaire's conquest. It was a desperate, tender meeting of two souls who had been broken by the same cold world. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and shared trauma. A silent vow that whatever happened at the signing tomorrow, they would face it together. But the moment of peace was shattered by the ping of an encrypted message on James's phone. He pulled back, his face instantly hardening into the mask of the CEO. "It's Anthony Marks," James said, his voice cold. "He wants to meet. Tomorrow night at the Sovereign Room. He says the investors are getting impatient. They want the final signatures by midnight." Mary stood up, her legs no longer shaking. She reached for the printer and watched as the 63 pages of the honeypot began to slide out one by one. The white paper looked like armor in the dim light. "Let them be impatient," Mary said, her voice steady and lethal. "Voss thinks he's about to have his greatest victory. He thinks he's finally found a way to crush the uncrushable James Gillen." She picked up the stack of papers and handed it to James. The weight of it was substantial, the weight of her revenge, his freedom, and their future. "The tension is at its peak. James, they'll be expecting you to be nervous, to be desperate. You have to play the part of the cornered king." James took the contract, his fingers brushing hers. "And what will you be doing?" "I'll be in the room," Mary replied. "Not as a waitress. And not as your shadow. I'll be there as your lead counsel. When I lay this document on the table, I want to see the look in Anthony's eyes when he realizes he's not the one holding the leash anymore." James nodded, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "They have no idea what's coming for them. They think they're fighting a billionaire. They don't realize they're up against a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain." As they stood together by the window, looking out over the sleeping city, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Tomorrow, the trap would be sprung. Tomorrow, Raymond Voss would find out that the prosecutor he had tried to bury wasn't dead. She was just waiting for the right moment to strike. "One more thing, James," Mary whispered as they prepared for the final confrontation. "Yes? When this is over, I want to make sure no one else ever has to become invisible like I did." James pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "We will, Mary. We'll build something that ensures the truth is never a death sentence again. But first, let's go win a war." The air inside the private dining room of the Sovereign Room was colder than a morgue. The heavy oak doors were shut, sealing in the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of fear. Anthony Marks sat across from them, spinning a silver fountain pen between his fingers with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. Behind him stood 3 consultants, federal shadows in cheap suits, waiting for the moment they could claim James Gillen's empire as government property. But tonight, Mary wasn't refilling water glasses. She sat at the head of the table, next to James, dressed in a charcoal gray power suit that fit her like armor. Her hair was pulled back, her spine a rod of steel. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the storm. "James," Anthony said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily camaraderie. "Time is a luxury we don't have. These 63 pages of revisions, they're exhaustive. Why the sudden obsession with technicalities? One signature, and we can all go home as partners." James didn't answer. He reached under the table and squeezed Mary's hand. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a silent command to begin the execution. "Mr. Marks," Mary said, her voice cutting through the room like a jagged blade. "In my 12 years as a RICO prosecutor, I've seen many traps, but none as lazy as yours." Anthony's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the waitress he thought he had successfully dismissed. "Excuse me? You're the help, honey. Stay in your lane." "My lane is the law, Anthony," Mary replied, leaning forward into the light. "And your lane is a one-way trip to a federal penitentiary. You see, I spent the last 72 hours drafting this contract. Section 12, the one you so eagerly skimmed, explicitly states that North Point Holdings is a private commercial entity. By signing that page 10 minutes ago, you affirmed under penalty of perjury that no government officials are involved in this transaction." Mary pulled a digital tablet from her briefcase and slid it across the polished mahogany. "This is a real-time log of the encrypted server pings coming from your consultants behind you. They've been communicating with Raymond Voss's private office for the last hour. Since you've affirmed you are a private entity, these communications constitute a violation of the Wiretap Act and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You didn't just merge a company, Anthony. You documented a federal conspiracy to bypass the Fourth Amendment. The color drained from Anthony's face. The men behind him reached for their jackets, not for guns, but for their phones, realizing the digital trap had already closed around them. Wait, Anthony stammered, his bravado crumbling. This is a misunderstanding. We have immunity. You have nothing, Mary interrupted, her voice rising with a cold, righteous fury. I sent the unredacted files of your operation to the office of the Inspector General 3 hours ago. Raymond Voss isn't coming to save you. He's currently being escorted out of the Eastern District office in handcuffs. The honeypot worked, Anthony. You were so hungry for James's assets that you forgot the first rule of the hunt. Never underestimate the person who has already lost everything. The doors of the sovereign room burst open. But it wasn't Gillen's security. It was the Internal Affairs Division of the DOJ. As Anthony and his handlers were led out in silence, the weight of 2 years of exile finally lifted from Mary's shoulders. She felt light, almost ethereal, as the ghosts of her past were finally laid to rest. James stood up and walked around the table. He didn't look at the empty chairs or the abandoned contract. He looked only at her. The ruthless billionaire, the man who owned half the skyline, looked humbled in the presence of her brilliance. You did it, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. You didn't just save me, Mary, you saved the truth. We did it, James, she corrected, finally letting a small smile touch her lips. James took her hands in his. The trauma of her fall from grace, the exhaustion of the long shifts, the fear of being discovered, all of it seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his gaze. He didn't offer her a promotion or a bonus. He offered her his heart. Mary Hodges, James said, his voice steady but filled with a deep, resonating sincerity. I've spent my life building walls to keep people out. I thought power was a shield. But you showed me that real power is the courage to stand for what's right when everyone else is sitting down. I don't want to run this empire alone. I want you by my side, not as my lawyer, but as my partner in everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a flawless diamond that caught the light, symbolizing a new beginning. Will you build a new world with me? Tears finally spilled over Mary's lashes, but they were tears of triumph. Yes, James, 1,000 times, yes. 6 months later, the headlines didn't just talk about stock prices or mergers. They talked about the Hodges-Gillen Foundation. Mary and James stood on the balcony of their new headquarters, a building dedicated to providing legal aid and resources to those wrongly accused or destroyed by corporate and federal corruption. Mary was no longer invisible. She was a beacon of hope for every person the system had tried to erase. As the sun set over the city, James pulled her close, his arm around her waist. They weren't just the most powerful couple in New York. They were the architects of a modern fairy tale where competence was the greatest weapon and love was the ultimate prize. You're not tired anymore, are you? James asked, kissing her forehead. Mary looked out at the city, her eyes bright with purpose. No, James, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The screen fades to black as the Destiny Shift logo appears. A final message lingers on the screen. True brilliance cannot be hidden. It only waits for the right moment to shine. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments with those who believe that destiny can change everything one day. Subscribe, because when destiny shifts, everything changes.